welcome to Turn the Page, the official podcast of the Syosset Public Library.
Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Turn the Page. I'm your host today, Jen, and I am joined by a prolific writer who is here to talk about an extraordinarily fun little sci-fi, noirish, cozy mystery. It is such a delight, and I am so excited to have this author here. So welcome. Could I ask you to introduce yourself and your book, please?
Hi everyone, I'm Olivia Waite. I write mostly historical romance, but also sci-fi and fantasy, strongly sapphic bent these days. I came up through historical romance, and I'm also the New York Times book review romance fiction columnist.
You've written in a bunch of genres and subgenres, as you were just saying. So I'm very curious about what your journey to this project was. I really, because there are glimmers of romance in this, but there are all these new little subgenres and things going on as well. So I'm curious about, like, yeah, what made you choose this project and what new opportunities and challenges did this new genre present to you?
Well, I've always been a multi-genre reader. My first romance novel that I ever read was also a sci-fi novel, and so this goes way back for me. So I was that kid in the days before the internet when you had to go to your local bookstore and comb the shelves and hope you saw something new that you hadn't seen before. And every week they'd have the new releases on Tuesdays. And so I was always combing the sci-fi fantasy shelves as well as the historical romance shelves. I was reading mysteries by the grocery bag. You'd have older relatives who would show up with a bag full of books that they had finished that they were now passing on to the other relatives. And so I read like Lillian Jackson Braun. I read M.C. Beaton, both her mysteries and her historicals. I read Douglas Adams and every Terry Pratchett I could scrounge from the used bookstores before he was in print again in the States. Oh, those were bleak days.
Wow.
We had to like hunt down the Discworld novels one by one and out of order.
Oh my gosh, yeah, and Douglas Adams too. I remember when I was a teen, like in the mid 90s, I had to order an out of print copy. It's wild to think of now.
Yeah. No, and I was lucky. I some that B. Dalton that was closest to my house had the omnibus edition of Hitchhiker's Guide, so all five books in one giant volume.
Nice.
Yeah. So for me, it was I happened to be published in historical romance first because romance became like my escape after college and graduate school and while working in bookstores because it was friendly, it was accessible, and I just I loved that you're kind of doing multiple stories at once in a romance because you have character A and character B, and they both have to have arcs while you're doing the external plot. And so it's this very layered, balanced kind of structure. And then, you have to get to the happy ending, but how you get there is completely wide open. And so it's been really fun. And so combining that with sci-fi world building was just a fun challenge. I've always had way more ideas than I could turn into books, and it's just a question of which one comes out first.
That's so interesting. Yeah, and I love, adding the sort of the cozy vibe to something that is could very easily be an epic story in nature, because we have the HMS Fairweather, which is a an interstellar generation ship that's on a 1,000+ year journey, and that could lead to, that like really big, epic, wide, like Dune-like storytelling. But setting cozy stories in that world is such a nice little entry point, and it lets you feature like different features of world building. So that was like a perfect lead into my next question. Like, what was your approach to world building the ship, and the library in particular? Because I think just like the library is such a fascinating concept.
Well, part of it is just reading too many cool science articles on things like solid state glass memory, which
Mhm.
is just really fascinating stuff. And it's where they actually do like laser etch information into a glass cube. And so it's really stable because it's not like a reflective surface like a CD-ROM or however we're storing things in the cloud these days. And so it's really stable and it will last hundreds of thousands of years. And so that combined with when you work in bookstores for long enough, you start to feel like even if you go to other bookstores, the books you've read and the books you've shelved, even the ones you haven't read start to feel like old friends. And so you see their covers and they feel like, oh, I know that guy. And so it's a pretty short leap from there to imagining that you would choose to be stored as a book, like in a spaceship. And the Generation Ship was just fun because I had been reading a lot. It was the early pandemic. I was reading a lot of Wodehouse. I was watching a lot of Agatha Christie adaptations. We were mainlining every episode of Poirot. And somebody out on Twitter was like, why don't they set more mysteries on generation ships? It's a perfect little locked room setting. And so here I was with somebody talking about sci-fi ships and my brain all mired in like 1920s Golden Age mysteries. And it just went whoomp in my head. And I'm like, yeah, that's what I want. I want to read that immediately, but nobody's doing it. So I have to write it first and then I can read it. So it was really just it was a fun game that my brain wanted to play. My brain wanted to exist in this world and it just kind of the more I thought about it, the more little corners became interesting. And so the world building really kind of developed organically and just as a fun game and like all of the wish fulfillment things. Like we don't need police on this world. We don't have poverty. Everybody's like secure in their homes and secure with like their food and subsistence. And so what do you do with your time? Well, you would do your hobbies and you would, well, you know, everybody who says, "Oh, I would start a bookstore if it wasn't about the money." And I would you know, run a little yarn store or a cafe. We saw that during the pandemic. Everybody suddenly was, you know, stuck at home. And what did people start doing? They started making art, they started making bread, they started getting really into hobbies and practicing musical instruments. Humans are extremely bad at being bored.
That is so fascinating. I never really thought about how, yeah, the pandemic did give us this little glimpse about what would happen if your your financial resources was no longer tied to your work or your productiveness, and people turned to other sorts of production, and all this creative stuff happened.
Mhm.
Like I've been doing this podcast since 2021, and I'm still talking to people who conceived of their projects during the pandemic. So it was like very fertile for novelists for sure.
Yeah.
I love the choice of a murder mystery too, because it does let you really grapple with the specific implications of like the technology you've imagined. Like in a world where you are functionally immortal, your body can die, but like your continuity as a person and your memories won't. So that would totally change your relationship to death and what the meaning of death in society. And so, yeah, because you talk about sort of grafting a murder mystery onto this world that you created.
Well, I mean, some of it is as soon as you like a lot of people try to imagine tech as kind of perfect in sci-fi. That's kind of the first step is, oh, we're going to have this magical brain storage solution and it's always going to work perfectly. And what do we do with it then? Well, I don't know if you know anybody who has storage issues like right now with their computer, but everyone I know doesn't back their computer up. They don't back up their files nearly as much as they should. They keep things on old formats. They run things through the laundry. So, so part of the fun is, okay, we have this theoretically great system, but where does it break down where the rubber meets the road? And that's always where your murders happen and your crimes and your solutions need to be found. And I'd been reading, you know, I started off with Douglas Adams and comic sci-fi, but in later years, I've been reading a lot of Bujold and Anne Leckie and Eliot de Bodard. And so these very different visions of the future that I find really rich and compelling. And so part of this is me writing back into a conversation with like ancillary justice's idea of a ship mind that's split into multiple bodies. And I guess spoilers for anybody who doesn't know, but and Elia de Bodard's sentient spaceships and all those things that kind of harken back to a very classic trope as well with Anne McCaffrey, the ship who sang, you know, all that good stuff. So it's just really my brain's kind of a magpie. It likes to grab things from a bunch of different places and put them together and see what comes out. And so, you know, when you've been reading Anne Leckie and Raymond Chandler and watching Agatha Christie, this is kind of what happens.
So let's talk a little bit about Dorothy Gentleman. I loved her as a POV character and as a detective. I'm very, very curious about, you know, her love of knitting And whether that was personal, like whether you are into knitting yourself. I do not know how to knit, but I'm a great admirer of the art. And B, do you think those things, detecting and knitting, go together well? Because as I was thinking about it, like they both require detail work and methodicalness. So can you talk about like, yeah, building her as a character?
Well, it's definitely a personal interest. I've been knitting for a lot of years now, more or less successfully. I'm actually really excited right now because I had to take a year off. I had an injury to some of the joints of my hands. And I could still type, fortunately, but like knitting was right out. Like the doc was like, absolutely, worst thing you could do, do not do it. And I'm like, oh, bummer. And so I've been away for a year, and I recently was like, you know what? I'm feeling strong. I'm doing a lot of other activities. It's time for me to try to see if the knitting works. And it's been so exciting to get back to. And so I've really missed it. And there's this very subversive history of knitting as well. For instance, in World War II, there's a lot of examples we have of female spies sending messages via knit work. And so, like, a woman sitting at the window watching the train tracks and noting in her knitting stitches what supplies are going by and being able to pass that message along. And so there's this very kind of espional quality to it that it looks demure and it looks very domestic, but it's actually really deeply empowering. I have kind of an interest in the fiber arts just in general. I mean, that's how I ended up with Ladies' Guide to Celestial Mechanics, where one of the heroines is an embroiderer because I started learning embroidery at the start of the pandemic and was like, or like, no, that was 2018. Gosh, that's forever ago.
Before times.
Before times, yeah. And I realized, I think embroidery is really neat. And I read like three heroines in a row who were like, oh, I disdain the feminine art of embroidery. And I'm like, yeah, but why though? And so asking the yeah, but why though about knitting is is partly what led me here.
Yes. Yeah, I love her point of view. She's very funny, but also deadly serious about her work, which is a really fun combo. And there are so many great characters. I really love in particular Ruthie and Violet, the proprietor of the yarn store. Um, could you talk about who was your favorite character to write, and then perhaps who was the most challenging?
Oh gosh. Well, look, I love a hapless nephew. I really do. So Ruthie is like the star of my heart in some ways. And I feel that's partly because I put a lot of myself into Dorothy. And so that kind of that sense of always being an observer and always having like a second thought in the back of her head is something that I feel very connected to. And so the counter you need to that is somebody who is open and sincere and vulnerable and not afraid to look a bit silly. And so that combination of like the wary, narrow-eyed observer with the open, puppyish, lovable character is something that I'm always kind of drawn to. And I see that in a bunch of my favorite, like, if you're talking about the Vorkosiverse, then you've got Miles always has Ivan around. And so you kind of need that balance. And so for me, those two were really the heart of where the series started as characters, and people like Violet came after, and future books have characters that I've been having a ton of fun writing as well, but we haven't met them yet, so I'm going to just let that slide. But yeah, this is the start of a series, and so we're going to see a lot more of Violet. We're going to see a lot more of Dorothy, and one of the fun things about this series, because we have the library, we can make huge leaps forward in time and we can change all the characters' ages because they don't have to always be older or younger. And so you can have slightly different dynamics based on is Ruthie older than Dorothy in some of these, for instance.
Oh, that is so fun. And I am so glad to hear that there are more of these because I could spend so much more time with these characters so happily. And that you did bring up one of my favorite traits of Dorothy that I forgot to mention, that as somebody who myself is like really striving for cool aunt energy, she's very
Yeah.
aspirational in that regard. So could you talk a little bit about, this is a sort of minor detail, but it's one that I really, really loved, the memory cocktails. One of the characters is a
Mm.
sort of memory mixologist. And yeah, could you talk about how the development of that idea, and perhaps like if you were to design a memory cocktail, what would you have?
Oh gosh. Well, for me, I think the Summer Storm really is kind of ideal. The good folks at Tor actually made a memory cocktail as part of the promo. They let me do a little cartoon of which
So
is fun,
cute.
but they put together like a whole recipe. And I'm so happy about it. It's based on A Dark and Stormy.
Yeah, it sounds delicious.
Yeah.
That's so
Oh, sorry, I got so excited. I was running all the way to the living room. Um, this is going to sound pretentious as all hell, but the memory cocktails are absolutely my version of Proust's Madeleine because I started reading À la recherche de temps perdu, not in French, obviously, but the really excellent English translation, and surprised myself by being completely and ridiculously into it, like to an absurd degree. And it starts off and it's like anxious baby Marcel is lying in bed, afraid to fall asleep because what if he dies in his sleep? And I'm like, I love you. I would die for this man. Why is this the best thing? I'm like riveted. And I'm like, this is the most cliche book opening. Is this why it's cliche? Because Proust did this and now nobody else can live up. But he's always in his own head. And the Madeline moment is kind of, he talks about it's this foods connected to memory and the intensity of remembering via sensory experience. And so I was thinking about being in a spaceship, and I was, this was during the lockdowns in the early pandemic. And I was thinking about all of the things that you would miss if you could never leave, the four walls of your home. And so it was things like if you're in space, you're not going to have beaches, you're not going to have weather, you're not going to have wind and outdoors and, nature in general. Like they do their best with the garden in the center of the ship, but we all know it's artificial and it's very much like a stopgap. And so in order to keep those memories vivid, because they're not really using them, because like, you're in the middle of space, you're doing other things with your brain at the moment, you're not standing in the ocean. So in order to keep those memories vivid, I invented the memory cocktails because it's important for people from Earth to maintain memories of Earth so that once they're on a planet again, that they won't be completely at sea. And then that comes up again later in the series as well, that this becomes there's a whole thing. So
that's so fascinating. And it really does it's a nice detail in you know, like the whole reason that they are able to be reborn continually is so that there is this continuity between Earth and where they are going. And to, yeah, like all of the little measures that you would have to think of in order for that memory to be intact and vivid after such a long period of time. Like it's all just such an interesting world that you've thought through. And I am so excited to read the next ones. I don't want you to spoil anything that you don't want to spoil. You have said that there will be more.
mhm.
In them, are we going to learn anything more about, and I hope I don't butcher this, the Antikythera Club?
Oh yeah, no, book two has some scenes that are very much set at the Antikythera Club, um, which is named after one of my favorite ancient machines. I was a classical scholar before I went working in bookstores, so but it's named after the Antikythera mechanism, which sort of came up in the new Indiana Jones Nails on a Chalkboard, but it is one of the earliest calculating machine examples that we have, and it's from like the 3rd century. God, I want to say BC. I don't think it's AD. 3rd century, let's just say. And it's a celestial calculator, and so it predicts the timing of eclipses and the phases of the moon and things like that, all based on the number of teeth on each individual gear. They've constructed working replicas. They've constructed working replicas out of Lego even. And so when I thought about, well, what would the Geniuses Leisure Club in space be named? This kind of was the natural choice. And they cause all sorts of trouble. They're always up to something.
Excellent. Yeah, I found that was such an interesting little glimpse. And it is like really just such a fun read. And I am so excited to see where it goes. Thank you so much for joining us and for sharing this book with us. I am very excited to recommend it to our patrons.
Oh, well, thank you so much. This was a lovely interview.
Thanks. Okay, listeners, it's on you. Please check out Murder by Memory. By the time that you hear this, it will be out in the world. So head to your favorite bookstore or library, wherever you like to go for your books. Okay, it is time to close this chapter. We'll see you next time. Bye.
It's time to close this chapter of Turn the Page. Join us for the next episode.